Welcome to this audiovisual presentation on the topic of attitudes and persuasion. In this presentation, what I hope to do is introduce you to the concept of attitudes as defined, as psychology sees them, and then as well as helping you to understand what an attitude is and how it affects us, I also want to then look at how our attitudes are changed, or how we change the attitudes of others through the act of persuasion. I also hope to show you how fundamentally attitudes and persuasion are integral parts of education, and so as educators we need to be interested both in the attitudes of our students, but also in the act of persuasion and how to persuade others to change their attitudes. Now, if you ask people sort of in an everyday sense what do they mean by the word attitude, it tends to be used to describe somebody's way of interacting with the world around them, the entire world. So if you said, talk about somebody having a positive attitude, you're generally talking about that they're a positive person and deal with situations and people in a positive way. And if you say they have a negative attitude, it usually means the opposite. Within psychology, though, we tend to see attitudes as a more focused thing, focused on a specific object. Now, that object could be a thing, a physical thing, like a can of Coke, or it could be a person, like the person teaching them in their classroom, or it could be an issue, like being a member, Britain being a member of the European Union. And so you have attitudes towards these things. Now, in its original use in psychology, an attitude still just meant how you felt about that thing. So if you liked it, you had a positive attitude. If you didn't like it, you had a negative attitude. This is sometimes called the unidimensional approach. But as we studied attitudes, we began to realize that actually they were more complex than just feelings. Alongside the feeling also went certain beliefs about that thing. Usually the beliefs in some way informed the feeling, or they explained the feeling. So the reason why you liked it, or the reason why you disliked it. What you knew about it informed the feeling. And as we studied attitudes more, we also realized that prior behaviours, how you reacted towards the attitude of the object in the past, also informed people's feelings. Now, that might seem odd, that our past behaviour tells us how we feel about something, but you'd be surprised how often we do that. We look at our own behaviour to figure out how we feel about something, and we realise things about ourselves sometimes by looking at how we've acted in the past. So these days, when we talk about somebody's attitude, we tend to use what's called the tripartite model and say that attitude is a combination of how they feel about the thing, what they know about it, or what they think they know about it, because we don't always know the truth, and also how they've reacted to that thing in the past. Now, you can see how this might be relevant to education, in that you're likely to have an attitude towards the things you're learning. You're likely to have an attitude towards the people who are teaching you, or if you're an educator, the people you are teaching. And so this is going to be of interest, and it's going to explain certain things about you. And the reason why we think that attitudes will explain certain things about you, whether that's in education or elsewhere, is because within psychology we believe that attitudes in some way inform behaviour. And that's what makes an attitude so interesting to us. It's this link, or this potential link between attitudes and behaviour, that make attitudes so exciting, both as an area of research, but also as a potential area of interest to anyone really, educators, non-educators, anyone interested in influencing the behaviour of others. If attitudes are an important part of predicting our behaviour, so if the reason that we do the things we do is because of our attitudes towards those things, then not only will attitudes help you to predict behaviour, because if you know somebody's attitudes and attitudes predict behaviour, then you'll be able to know what they're going to do. You could also then, even more interestingly, maybe change their behaviour. If attitudes in some way influence our behaviour, then if you could change somebody's attitudes, you could then change their behaviour. And change of behaviour is the goal of people in all walks of life, or at least in many walks of life. So everybody from the sort of government who want us to say, buy British or vote for them in the next election, or an educator who wants you to study harder or to turn up for their class, or the marketing executive who wants you to buy Coke and not Pepsi. Each of these people is interested in changing your behaviour for their own ends sometimes, or for good or bad reasons. And if they think that behaviour is guided by your attitudes, then maybe one way to get you to change behaviour is to persuade you to change your attitudes, and that will in turn have an impact on your behaviour. Now, the theory is simple. Change a person's attitudes, it will change their behaviour. But of course, the link between attitudes and behaviour is not simple. Most of the time, attitudes and behaviour are in agreement, but not always. And so, it's never as simple as thinking, well, once I've changed somebody's attitudes, I'm guaranteed to change their behaviour. It doesn't always work like that. Sometimes our attitudes and behaviour can be in disagreement, and that's the next issue we're going to look at. While it is true that in most cases people's attitudes and behaviour are in alignment, that we tend to act in a way that is consistent with how we feel about the world around us and how we feel about various different issues and things and people, it is also reasonably common that in certain situations or for certain people, attitudes and behaviour are not in agreement, that in fact how they feel about something and what they actually do about that thing or person are quite different, sometimes almost in complete opposition with each other. Now, typically, this phenomenon, which was termed dissonance by Festinger, he studied it back in the late 50s, early 60s, it's something we don't normally notice is happening, and that's how it can exist. That typically having either two attitudes which are in direct contradiction to each other, or having an attitude that was in contradiction to our behaviour, is something that can only persist as long as we're not aware of it. The minute we become aware of it, we tend to do something to try and resolve the dispute, to resolve the disagreement. And this was another part of Festinger's dissonance theory, that dissonance is something that only lasts as long as we don't know it, and the minute we start to notice it, we change. Now, the way we change varies. Sometimes if we have two attitudes that are in disagreement with each other, so, for example, if we think that sort of slave labour or sweatshop labour is wrong, and yet we like to get the cheapest clothes possible, we then tend to change one of the attitudes to make them more consistent. So we either might say, well, actually, getting the cheapest clothes is not the most important thing. Sometimes it's worth paying extra if you know the workers are being treated well. Or you might change the other attitude and think, well, actually, I'm sure some of the dangers of sweatshops are exaggerated. I'm sure it's not so bad. And so now your two attitudes are more consistent again. Similarly, if the attitude and the behaviour are not consistent, then sometimes we change the attitude and sometimes we change the behaviour. And an example of this, and I'm trying to show one on the slide, is if a student who thinks that they are a good student, a dedicated student, has not been turning up for their classes like they should, it tends to kind of go one of two ways. Either the realisation acts like a bit of a prompt, a bit of a prod to get their act together and start turning up more regularly, as they should if they're a good student. Or sometimes they'll find a way to, we might call it rationalise it, but Festinger would say we're adjusting the attitude or adjusting our beliefs, because remember, beliefs are part of an attitude, in order to make the attitude consistent to behaviour. So we say to ourselves, oh well, those particular classes, they're not important classes, or well, I was using that time to read up on something to do with the assessment. And so in that way, they help to keep their behaviour unchanged. They're still not turning up for class as often as they should, with their belief or attitude towards themselves that they are a good student. And so it's interesting to see how we can do that, how we can, when we spot this inconsistency, find a way to make the world right again, usually by adjusting something so that the pieces fit together better. thus far we've looked at the question of what an attitude is, what is it made up of, and we've looked at the link between attitudes and behaviour, and how normally attitudes predict behaviour, but occasionally they don't, and we have to then adjust either the attitude or the behaviour to make them consistent. But where do the attitudes come from in the first place? Do they emerge at a particular age, or do they arrive in a particular way? It's very hard often to trace the exact origin of an attitude. I mean, consider any of the attitudes you hold now. Let's say you are someone who feels very strongly about climate change. Can you pinpoint the moment when you developed your current attitude, either climate change is important, we need to do something about it, or climate change is exaggerated and they're making a big deal of it? It's hard to know exactly when you first began to feel that way. As such, studying the origin of attitudes is tricky, since people themselves aren't able to tell you where the attitude came from. One possibility is that we develop attitudes through sort of classical conditioning, so that essentially you have a positive experience with something, which creates a positive association in your head between that thing and feeling good, and that the attitude emerges from there. So maybe the first few times you got into a swimming pool or into the sea, you had a good time there, so that is the origin of your positive attitudes towards swimming. Other times it may be that maybe you didn't learn it firsthand. Maybe you learned it through observing others. They call this modelling. So that effectively sometimes we learn our attitudes towards observing the behaviour and attitudes of people who are important to us, like our parents or our teachers. And a very good example of this is often phobias can be passed down from parents to children. And so we learn by seeing them rather than doing it ourselves. It's interesting that once an attitude is formed, even a very basic attitude, it can then grow by affecting what we see, or how we interpret what we see, and what we remember. This is what I mean by biases and perception and recall. So it may be that you start with a very mild positive attitude or a very mild negative attitude towards something, but then over time that attitude grows stronger, because if you like it, you tend to notice the good things about it and you tend to remember those good things, so the attitude grows stronger. And it works in reverse. If you didn't like it, if your first encounter was a negative thing, then you tend to remember and notice the negative stuff more, and the attitude grows stronger in that way. This lays a fairly important responsibility then on an educator who may be introducing students to new ideas and new concepts all the time. That first experience, which we are responsible for, can have a very lasting effect this way. So no pressure then, you might say, as a teacher. Learning theory and conditioning or modelling are not the only methods that have been proposed for the origin of some of our attitudes. A really interesting theory was first proposed by Dissonance. I know that's not how it looks on the slide, Z-A-J-O-N-C, but Dissonance is how it's pronounced, his name. Dissonance said that, contrary to the proverb which said that being exposed to something over and over again might make you not like it, Dissonance believed that actually being exposed to something, even if you're not fully paying attention to it, will generally produce a positive attitude towards that thing. And he called this mere exposure. And there is some evidence to suggest that being exposed to something which you had up until that point avoided, maybe because you had heard bad things about it, can actually have a very beneficial effect on reducing prejudice. A lot of advertising, you might say, works on this principle, the idea that if you can expose people to the product, if you can make them aware of it, it will translate into a mildly positive attitude towards the product, which may make them more likely to buy it or choose it when they see it then later in their shopping. This idea that a brief exposure might produce a positive attitude would seem to then lend credibility to a concept which is mentioned a lot of times in popular culture of subliminal influences in subliminal advertising. And I guess one of the questions I want to look at now is there any truth to that? Can a very brief, even sometimes a subconscious exposure to a product or an idea lead you to have a positive attitude towards that? Is there something to worry about when people talk about subliminal advertising? Just in case you've never encountered them, I probably should explain what a subliminal message or subliminal advert is. It's generally a message which is communicated to you in such a way that you're not aware of having seen it, but that somehow through your subconscious it changes your behaviour. Now the original, I think the very first time subliminal messages of any kind were proposed or said to be used is back in the 50s, where you have essentially a report by Packard in a book he was writing about another individual, Vickery, who claimed that he had successfully used subliminal adverts to increase the sale of drinks in cinemas. And what Vickery claimed he had done was to insert a single frame into a film strip. Now, film strips show you 24 frames a second, so you wouldn't be aware of having seen a single one if it were different from the others. And Vickery claimed he'd put in single frames of deserts into films that otherwise didn't contain them, and that although the audiences weren't aware of having seen these single frames because they flashed by so quickly, that drink sales in those cinemas which had used this technique rocketed up. And Vickery was using this as a way of essentially promoting himself, because he was a marketing executive who was sort of trying to convince people to hire him. And Packard reported it along with other similar tactics and techniques, and it really caught the popular imagination that this sort of thing might be going on without them knowing it, that they might be being manipulated. And a number of books and a number of other sort of commentators jumped in, and you have much later you have Key writing quite a lengthy book about full of claims that sexual subliminal adverts were being used all the time by advertisers to make products more attractive to us, that they were secretly including sexual imagery or sexual hidden sexual messages in their adverts in order to make those products more attractive. Now, that was the sort of advertising use of subliminals. There was another way that subliminal adverts or subliminal messages were supposedly used and continue to be used to the current day, which is getting people to listen to things while they're asleep. And this was supposed to have a subliminal effect, so that originally they were tapes, and then they became CDs, and I'm sure now they're MP3s, and in the future there'll be something else, but they're essentially audio messages that you listen to while you're asleep, and it subliminally is supposed to have these beneficial effects. Help you quit smoking, boost your confidence, even improve your memory. But is any of this true? I mean, on the surface, the mere exposure effect, which has been shown to be reliably have some effect on your attitudes, exists. So is that what subliminals are using? And if you're wondering if you've ever encountered a subliminal message yourself, let me show you a few examples. Have you ever seen Disney's The Lion King? Well, if you have, there are certain groups in the United States who say that you've been exposed to a subliminal message, a subliminal sexual message. The story about this comes from a group who, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, were already opposed to Disney and already felt that Disney's films were too sexual and contained inappropriate messages for children. And amazingly, this same group also found what they feel are hidden sexual messages in Disney films. You might question their objectivity. I don't know. Yeah, it's possible they were just incredibly lucky they were the ones that found these hidden messages, but they say they did. On the screen there you can see a scene in The Lion King where the main character Pumbaa flops down onto the ground and a big puff of dust shoots up, and although the dust is just random, apparently if you look closely enough at it you can see the word sex written in the dust, and this was supposedly a hidden sexual message. Why exactly Disney wants to promote sex, That's not so clear, but this group called the American Life League claimed that one of their members, one of the little children, saw this message and told their parents about it. I guess that adds more to the sinisterness of it, that the child saw it and told the parents. So children are seeing these messages. Parents beware. Of course, this isn't the only case where people have claimed to have found subliminal messages. On this next slide here, you'll see two links. Now, hopefully these links will remain working. The net does change from time to time, but I'd like you to pause the video and type in these addresses into your web browser and view the videos on YouTube that they're linked to. In the first one, pause video and watch the first one. Hopefully you've watched the first video now. There you see what is essentially a modern version of what Vickery claimed to be doing way back in the 50s, inserting a single frame of a brief image, so brief that you're not supposed to be able to know you've seen it, but that hopefully it will make you want to do something. In Vickery's case, it was buy drinks. In this case, it's supposedly McDonald's using sinister subliminal adverts. And the news item is taking it very seriously. These people seem to genuinely think that there might be something sinister going on here, McDonald's manipulating us. Of course, nobody questions whether or not actually seeing a single frame will have any impact. It's so widely believed that subliminal advertising works at some level that we're worried about whether or not it does exist and don't even pause to think about whether or not it does work. Of course, not all the subliminal message theories are so rational. I'd like you to watch the second video now. Just pause this recording and watch the second video. Right, hopefully you didn't watch the whole thing. I think watching the first 20 minutes is probably enough to get the general gist of what this person is on about. I think they're a little bit nuts. I think that they are seeing things almost everywhere. I think this is one of the issues with subliminal messages, is that once you go looking for them, it's very easy to think you find them everywhere. And there is the possibility that when people see subliminal messages, I'm not talking about the first example where there clearly was a single image of the McDonald's logo, but I'm talking about the second one where you see hidden messages within an image, that often you might be projecting what you want to see or what you're looking for, what you're hoping to see, onto what you're seeing. So a bit like staring at a cloud and seeing a shape where there isn't one. So for those kind of subliminal messages, I would say a lot of those are just nonsense or projection, people seeing what they want to see or sort of letting their imagination run away with them. But what about the other kind? What about the first one, the one where you see there is actually a single frame of an image like a McDonald's logo or a picture of a desert like Vickery said? Or what about the people who claim that they listen to tapes at night and that even though they're not conscious, that their unconscious mind is programmed by listening to these subliminal messages? Does it work? The short answer to that question is no, it doesn't work. None of this subliminal stuff works. None of the subliminal advertising works, and the subliminal self-help stuff doesn't work either. The people who promote this kind of thing usually try to sort of tack on to a particular area of psychology and use that as a method of giving scientific credibility to their claims. So they'll use Freudian theory about the unconscious mind and try to say, look, that's how we work, through the unconscious mind. But even Freud acknowledged that there was no way to really access the unconscious mind directly and no way of programming it directly. And with mere exposure, you can't use mere exposure to claim scientific support for subliminal messages, because for mere exposure to have an effect, you have to be aware that you were exposed to it. It doesn't work if you're not aware that you've been exposed to it, if you didn't actually see the brief glimpse of whatever it was that you got merely exposed to. It only works if you consciously know that you've seen it before. And so it wouldn't apply to subliminal messages where you're not consciously aware of having seen them. Now, even if you discredit the links they've made to psychology, well, what about the claims they make working somehow, even if it isn't by the means they say they work? Well, most of the research shows that, no, that's not true either. Research which has actually tried to study empirically, using sort of scientific controls, the effects of subliminal advertising has failed to show it having any impact on consumer choices. Interestingly, the person who kind of kicked it all off way back in the 50s, who made the original claims about Vickery, made the original claims about having successfully used subliminal advertising. Later on, Vickery actually admitted that he'd made up the whole story to boost his market research consulting business. So he lied about it having the effect he said it had. And the other person I mentioned, Kay, who produced the book about all these supposed sexual subliminals in adverts, never actually produced any evidence at all to support their claim. So subliminal advertising is a complete bunk. You don't have to worry about it. It doesn't work. And people who sort of say it does are generally either misguided or believe out-of-date and discredited claims. What about subliminal self-help? Well, the evidence again shows no real effect. People will often report feeling more confident or having better memory or being less inclined to smoke after sort of taking the appropriate self-help tape. But a lot of that is what they call the placebo effect, where people believe there's going to be an effect, and so their belief creates the effect that happens. There's nothing actually happening there. To prove this, Greenwald et al. Did a really interesting test where they gave people these sort of subliminal self-help tapes and asked them to report whether or not the tapes improved their memory. And a large number of people who participated in the study said, oh yes, listening to that tape when I was asleep did help my memory. However, the tape was supposedly there to boost self-confidence and not memory at all. So it wasn't supposed to have the effect they thought it did, but since they'd been told it was going to be a memory-helping tape, surprise, surprise, they reported improvements to their memory. This shows that it is very much a placebo effect. People report changes because they expect to find changes, but you don't need to plow your money into self-help, subliminal self-help tapes. They don't work. I guess in a nutshell, you can put all your concerns or hopes about subliminal messages changing who you are to bed. None of it works. Where does that leave us? Well, what we've learned so far is that the psychological concept of an attitude represents your feelings, beliefs, and previous behaviour in relation to an attitude object, which could be a thing or a person or event or an issue. And that a lot of the interest in attitudes stems from the idea that attitudes are generally thought to predict behaviour, that once you know somebody's attitudes, you'll know what their behaviour is going to be, and also the belief at some level that if you can change their attitudes, you might be able to change their behaviour. We've also looked at some of the potential origins for attitudes, and I would say the research shows that on the whole we tend to learn attitudes through either our own direct experiences, through conditioning, or through observing the experiences of others through social learning. We can develop some attitudes merely by being briefly exposed to the attitude object, but these attitudes don't tend to be as strong or as long-lasting. I've also learned that any claims or fears about subliminal influences on our attitudes are complete nonsense and nothing to be afraid of. Having looked at attitudes, the next thing I want to now look at is how we change attitudes, or how our attitudes are changed by others. That means studying persuasion. What is persuasion, though? I guess this is one of those few occasions where the everyday use of the term and the psychological use of the term are fairly similar, if not exactly the same. We persuade somebody, usually trying to convince them of something. So in terms of attitudes, we are essentially trying to change their attitude. And in some cases, persuasion, it's still called persuasion when you're trying to, if you like, create an attitude that might not be there already, although that's rare. Typically, persuasion is about changing an existing attitude, usually trying to alter the emotional resonance of it, maybe change a positive attitude into a negative one, or vice versa, or potentially changing what someone believes to be true about the attitude object. Now, ultimately, when we talk about persuading people in everyday terms, we're usually trying to persuade them to do something. And persuasion in a psychological sense is really just about changing the attitude. That's what persuasion is, the act of changing the attitude. But I'd say it goes almost without saying that the purpose of changing the attitude is hoping to change their behaviour. So we're coming back to that central idea that attitudes predict behaviour, and that about, if you want to change the behaviour, you go about it by changing the attitude first, and that will have a knock-on effect of changing the behaviour. It may be something that you're wondering now at this point that, well, okay, this is all very interesting about attitudes and persuasion, but are we still talking about education here in any sense? How is persuasion and attitudes anything to do with the psychology of education? One way to answer that question, or one way to look at it, is essentially to consider that effectively almost any form of education is an act of persuasion. That often when we are educating people, we are trying to sort of inform them, we're trying to shape them, mold them, or encourage their development in some way. Now, if you reduce sort of education down to only one form of school learning, memorizing times tables, it's hard to see that as an act of persuasion. But really, when you consider that a lot of education is nothing to do with the classroom, it's nothing to do with memorizing facts. A lot of education is about helping people to grow and develop and change and learn. And often a big part of that is trying to persuade them of the need to do something, or persuade them to do something, to change their lifestyle, to grow and develop in certain ways. I'll try to give some examples here on the slide that quite often when we are being asked to educate people in terms of community projects or health projects, we're really trying to persuade them to do something or to not do something anymore. And in that sense, studying attitudes and persuasion is hugely useful to an educator, because when it comes down to it, if we want to be a more effective educator, we want to be a more effective persuader. And so many of the things that we'll look at now in terms of how persuasion works and how to be more effective in persuading people are sort of techniques and principles that any educator who needs to persuade people to change their behaviour is going to find useful. What kind of things do we or have we learned through psychology about the act of persuasion? Well, interestingly, two separate theories emerged around about the same time, both of which came to roughly the same conclusion about the act of persuasion. Now, the two theories are so similar that sometimes they're referred to collectively as the dual process theories. There's the elaboration likelihood model and the heuristic systemic model. But fundamentally, they're both saying roughly the same thing, which is that when it comes to persuading people, there is, roughly speaking, two approaches that you can take. And although you may combine a bit of both of these in your attempt to persuade them, you tend to favour one approach or the other as your main method of persuasion. Now, what are the two approaches? Well, both models talk about a sort of a direct route, which they either call the central route or the systemic route, and this is about using facts as your main method of persuasion, trying to change people's beliefs and have a knock-on effect of changing their feelings and behaviour. Now the central method of persuasion is very effective, it's long-lasting, but it requires a lot of effort on the part of the listener. They have to really pay attention to the message and process it for it to have any effect. So this isn't always possible. The audience is not always going to be listening carefully, or not always going to want to spend a lot of effort making sense of what you're saying. So in some situations, it's better not to use the central route, but instead to use what the sort of peripheral route or heuristic route. Here, instead of facts, you tend to rely on emotions as your method of persuading, kind of pulling people's heartstrings would be the everyday way of describing it. And this is less demanding on the audience. They don't have to be paying as close attention. It's also very effective on certain issues, which are very emotionally charged issues. And it's very effective with certain audiences, maybe who don't want to spend a lot of effort making sense of the message, who want it to be simple or quick and easy. And so the dual process theories give us a real insight into the idea that there's more than one way to crack this problem of persuasion, and that sometimes which is the right route will depend on who you're trying to persuade and what issue you're trying to persuade them about. And sometimes they'll be listening to the facts of your message, and sometimes they'll be listening to the emotional content, and sometimes they'll be paying attention to who you are as a source of a message, what sort of person you are. And this idea that trying to understand the act of persuasion means looking at the source, the message itself, and the audience was picked up by another major theory of persuasion. This idea that we can take all the things we know about persuasion, all the things we know that affect persuasion, and break them down into one of three categories: things we know about the source, or the things about the source that affect its persuasiveness, things about the message that affect its persuasiveness, and things about the audience that affect how persuasible it is. This is sometimes known as the Yale Model, because it was this Yale group who were researching attitudes who first tried to organise all the things we know about attitudes into these three categories. And it's not so much a method of explaining how persuasion works as it simply is a method of just breaking up all the research that we know about persuasion into research about the source, research about the message, or research about the audience. And it's a handy way to break down a large field of research, and that's how we're going to break it down when we now look at the things that affect how persuasive a message is. We're going to start by looking at things that about the source that make it more or less effective as a persuader. We're going to look at things about the message that make it more or less persuasive, and then we're going to look at things about the audience that make them more or less sort of susceptible to persuasion. Starting off with the source, what are the things about the source of a persuasive message that make it more or less effective, make it more or less persuasive? Well, before I answer that, I'd like you to look at the YouTube video that's, you'll see the link to it on the slide there. Just type that address into your browser and see if you can find it. If you're having difficulty with the link, you could try searching YouTube for Sun Life and Parkinson, the TV presenter Parkinson, and see if you can see. It's an advert that he did promoting this Sun Life product. So I'm going to ask you to pause the recording and just have a look at that first. Okay, so what is it that makes Parkinson a very effective source, a very persuasive source for this particular message? Well, to begin with, he is a well-respected, well-trusted figure. He's seen to be a very, very sort of experienced, worldly individual, someone who's seen a lot and done a lot, and so someone that is held in high esteem, someone that we think of as an authority figure. And these qualities, his expertise and his trustworthiness, are both linked to a quality in sources that we call credibility. The more expert a source is, the more trustworthy it is seen to be, the more credible it is as a source and the more persuasive it is. And it's interesting that there are a number of things which will affect credibility. And usually there are things that make you look more like an expert or make you look more trustworthy. For example, speaking rapidly is often seen as a sign of expertise, possibly because the expert knows it all so well they can just rattle it off. Maybe this is a reason why so many lecturers like to speak rapidly. Maybe they just know at some level that it makes them look like more of an authority. Trustworthiness is generally something earned through sort of trustworthy behaviour, but often if somebody appears to be speaking against their own interests or with no obvious sort of agenda or possible benefit that they could be getting, that's seen as a sign of trustworthiness, and it makes them more credible as a source. So I guess in this case we've sort of seen Parkinson on the TV so much, we trust him to tell us the truth, and he's seen as an authority, so he's seen as an expert. The other quality about the source that makes them more persuasive is their attractiveness. Now, here we're not limiting just to physical attractiveness, although with any kind of showbiz personality, they're going to be slightly more physically attractive than the norm. But attractiveness is also dependent or kind of influenced by other qualities. So, for example, simply how pleasant or likeable the person is. Are they a nice person? I mean, we've all seen sort of interviews with very good-looking showbiz personalities who seem to be a little bit sort of harsh or maybe a little bit full of themselves, and these are not likeable qualities. But if someone can be both physically attractive and yet at the same time pleasant and likeable, it increases their attractiveness much more and makes them more persuasive. Another thing which sometimes you're less likely to find in a showbiz personality, but more likely to find in other sources of persuasive messages how similar the source is to the audience. So if the audience feels a connection to the source, if they feel they've got something in common with them, then that source is more persuasive. So in this case, although Parkinson may be a lot wealthier or maybe even better looking than most of his audience, and he's a celebrity and they're not, he's an older celebrity and it's being aimed at an older audience. So this similarity between him and the audience makes him more attractive, and I guess makes him more credible as well, that you feel like he's talking about something that he knows about. It wouldn't work as well if this was some teeny bopper telling you about how you want to, where you want to spend your retirement money. We just wouldn't see that person as similar to us if we were the target audience of this message. Of course, this raises certain questions about, do we really know the source of the message in many cases? Sometimes people are just being a spokesperson for someone else. So Parkinson isn't the person who actually is selling it to you, he's just representing them. So is he the real source? Most advertising is based on the idea that you'll take him as the source, the spokesmodel as the source. And it seems to work. So yeah, we seem to treat the person who actually tells us the message as the source. Although occasionally we will wonder who might be pulling their strings or who might be behind them. The source isn't the only thing that affects the message, but I want to just look very briefly at how some of these things we now know about the source might be related to education. Now that we know that qualities like credibility and attractiveness affect how persuasive a source is, what does that tell us that we can actually use in education? Well, I suppose it might be an argument in favour of maintaining your authority, your image of expertise in front of your students, since that's going to be something that affects how persuasive you are. If they don't see you as an expert, then you're going to be less persuasive, less effective as an educator. And this may explain to a certain degree why some lecturers, some teachers, some educators in general, I guess, are unsure about how to handle situations where they're asked a question they don't know the answer. Do you admit that you don't know the answer, or do you use one of those classic cheats that teachers use where they say, well, what do you think? Or let's put that one out to the rest of the class. I mean, is it okay to admit you don't know? Will that undermine your credibility? Certainly there's some argument to say yes, that if you are obviously someone who doesn't know the answers to many questions, that will harm your credibility and make you less persuasive and thus less effective as an educator. However, we should be aware that we also gain authority and credibility and expertise from other sources. It's not just from knowing the answers. And so sometimes we might be a bit too squeamish about losing even the smallest amount of credibility by admitting we don't know. Sometimes it might actually be a boost to our credibility if we're seen to admit that we don't know, because it makes us more trustworthy. You know, rather than pretending we know, we admit when we don't know. And trustworthiness is the other part of credibility along with expertise. We should also be aware that there's a possibility that admitting we don't know, or admitting we find something difficult, or admitting that, you know, we're not perfect, will make us more likable, because essentially it gives the students some way to identify with us. If we seem to be the perfect person who knows all the answers, the students aren't going to identify with that. But if we're someone who acknowledges that, hey, yeah, every now and again, even we don't know, that's a person we can identify with more, and that might make us more persuasive. There's a sort of a mirror image of this decision when, as an educator, we're faced with defending or standing by an unpopular decision. So the teacher who has to defend why some policy is being enacted in the school, or who has to sort of tell the students that they have to do something they don't want to do. How do you do that? How do you present that? I suppose a lot of educators find this difficult. So do you, as some educators will do, sort of throw your hands up and go, don't shoot the messenger, it's not my decision, I'm just following orders? Well, that is one way to approach it, and it might be seen as a way of reducing the negative impact of, being the source of an unpopular message. However, would your students respect you more, even though you might lose some of your likability for being the source of an unpopular message? Would they respect you for sort of not trying to duck behind some kind of excuse or try to sort of wash your hands of the whole thing and say it's nothing to do with me? That's hard to say. I think that there is something to be said for basically standing up there and taking responsibility and not trying to sort of duck out on it. And I think you might gain in credibility if you're doing that, even if it does dent your popularity slightly. But I guess I can still understand the teachers who feel uncomfortable about having to be the source of certain messages and certain policy decisions made at the higher levels or even by the government. And there is a temptation to just go, hey, I just work here. But I think people's concerns about its effect on their credibility and on the effect of their effectiveness as a teacher can be understood by looking at it through the lens of their persuasiveness as a source and what affects that. The source of the message, of course, is not the only thing that affects its persuasiveness. You can also look at the characteristics of the message, because often there you'll find some clues as to what makes a message more or less effective. Now, you'll see some links on the screen here. If you want, you can pause this presentation and go to YouTube to watch them. So you might pause me now, and once you've watched them, you can come back and we'll discuss them again. The message characteristics that you're seeing here in advert form are the classic distinction between emotional content versus intellectual content. And this comes back to the dual process theories of, do you use the central route of the fact-based messages, or are you trying for a peripheral heuristic method using emotion? And as I said back then, often the deciding factor on which route you choose depends on the audience you're trying to aim at and what exactly you're trying to persuade them about. Now, interestingly, that when you look at Dettol's adverts, they tend to go for emotion-based approaches, although the later example that you can see here towards the end of the slide is a combination of emotion and fact, but I would still say that it's playing heavily on emotion more than fact. So why choose that route for that product and that audience? Well, they're talking about safety and health, and these are emotive issues, and often they're issues that they're gut issues that we make with sort of emotional decisions rather than intellectual ones. So it's more of an emotional issue, so an emotional approach is more effective. Also, even though the purchase of some clean products is important because it helps protect our health, it's not a critical decision. There's not much money at stake. So people don't want to have to spend ages agonizing over that decision. They want to make it quickly, they want to make it easily. And that means that a central route where you bombard them with facts isn't really going to be very effective, because most people don't want to have to think that much about buying a cleaning product. And so if you're focusing on an audience who wants to make the decision quickly and easily without much thought, and it's an emotional issue, then an emotional approach is always going to be more effective. You need to be careful, though. If you turn the volume up too much on the fear, it can have a rebound effect in that people are so frightened by your message, they switch it off. And as we'll see later in terms of how you protect yourself against persuasion, simply avoiding the message is the most effective method. So you need to be careful with fear-based messages or any emotional-based messages that you don't overdo the emotion. By contrast, if you look at the other approach, the advert for the Kindle, the e-reader for e-books, there it tends to focus more on facts. Now, if you consider that when you're advertising something that is being aimed primarily at readers, you're aiming at people who are more intellectual, they're more educated, they like to think about their decisions, and so that's an audience that's going to respond better to a fact-based approach. But also the purchase of a high sort of cost item like an e-reader or a tablet or a laptop, it's an expensive purchase, and so it's not a purchase that people are going to make quickly, which means they're going to have the time and will want to spend the effort thinking about the decision before they make it, and that makes the central route more effective with them. So what this shows us here is that often the effectiveness of the content is really a feature of what you're trying to persuade them about and who you're trying to persuade. But even still, there are aspects of the content that you can tweak to make the message more or less effective no matter what your audience is, and we'll look at some of those next. Aside from the emotions compared to facts choice in terms of the content of the message, what other features of the message are important in terms of affecting its persuasiveness? Well, one characteristic of the message that seems to have a big impact on its persuasiveness is the position put forward by the message, the position it takes in relation to the attitude object, and the position that the audience already has. And by position I mean essentially how much is it in favour of the thing, against it. Is it very strongly favoured, very strongly against it? That position. Now, interestingly, when it comes to being the most persuasive, it's not always going to work the way you think it might. I mean, you might believe, for example, that if the message is putting forward the completely opposite position to the one the audience believes, that's not going to be very effective, but if it's putting forward the message the audience does believe, that is going to work. In truth, both extremes seem to be very ineffective in terms of achieving persuasion. If the position you're putting forward is very different from the audience's current position, not surprisingly, they don't listen, or at least they try to avoid the message. Oh, it's one of those, or those guys out there, oh, I don't listen to those guys. But interestingly, if the message you put forward is too similar to their existing position, they also don't listen, because there's a sense of, oh yeah, I know that stuff already. I don't need to hear that message. I know that. That's old news. And so both of these, one of them, the first one is the latitude of rejection, where it's too different, and the second one is the latitude of acceptance, where it's too similar. And it seems that the most persuasive message is the one which is different but not too different to the position that the audience already holds. They call this the latitude of non-commitment. So you don't instantly agree, because it's not exactly what you think, but you don't instantly disagree because it's not too different from what you think. And it seems that this is the point at which your message is going to be most persuasive. Now, of course, this is assuming that your audience all share a similar opinion, are in a similar position. It's trickier when you're communicating to a mixed audience who may all have different opinions. But generally speaking, if you are communicating to a mixed audience, your message will be most effective to the members of that audience who agree with you slightly, but not completely. These are the people that it really resonates with. So that's another major issue about the characteristic of the message which affects its persuasiveness. But what about the audience? So we've talked about them in general terms, but are there more specific things about the audience that make them easier or harder to persuade? Well, one of the things about the audience that is going to make them the hardest to persuade is the issue of selective exposure. And we'll look at this again in a minute when we talk about how you resist persuasion. But simply put, it's very hard to persuade people who aren't around to hear your message or who don't put themselves in the way of your message. And this is one of the reasons why viral advertising is often targeted specifically at certain age groups, because these are age groups that are difficult to reach by other ways. They don't tend to watch television much, they don't tend to read newspapers or even magazines, and so you need to use a method which they will encounter, and funny videos on the net for a long time was that method, and that's why so many viral adverts use that approach, because people will select to expose themselves to a funny message but maybe not so much to a more serious one. So that's one of the first things, I guess, is the fact that your audience will decide which messages it does or doesn't want to hear. The personality of the members of the audience tends to also have an effect on how easy they are to persuade. The issues, most important personality characteristics seem to be self-esteem and intelligence. Interestingly, the higher somebody's self-esteem is, generally the more resistant they are to attitude change, because they're more confident in their own opinion, whereas lower self-esteem is usually easier to persuade. However, there was an interesting phenomenon found that once self-esteem goes beyond a certain point, once it gets high enough, the person's persuasibility goes up again. They're slightly easier to persuade. And this was explained that once you get to a certain level of self-esteem, you're confident enough in your own opinion that you're not threatened by people with different opinions, and so you're more likely to listen. So it seems to be that it's somewhere in the middle or middle to upper end of self-esteem that you're most resistant to persuasion, whereas at the lower ends of self-esteem and at the very high ends, it's easier to persuade you. In terms of intelligence, there it doesn't necessarily determine your general persuasibility as much as it does how easy it is to persuade you using a direct, central, fact-based approach. As I mentioned earlier, more intelligent, educated people are more willing to spend the time thinking about the message and making sense of it, and also they find it easier to make sense of complex messages, and as such, it's easier to persuade somebody of a higher intelligence using a fact-based message than it is somebody. I'm not sure if I would use lower intelligence. I think it's misleading to think of intelligence as a quality. I would say higher levels of education compared to lower levels of education. The other quality about the individual that seems to affect how persuasible they are is their age. And here you have almost the opposite you found with self-esteem, that rather than it being at the periphery, the edges, or the extremes where they're more easily persuaded, here it seems to be somewhere in the middle. That I don't know if you'd call 18 and 25 the middle of anybody's life, but at ages younger than 18, it seems that we are quite resistant to persuasion. Possibly, I think, we accept the version of the world that we see around us that we grew up with without question, and so it's very hard to convince us of anything else other than what we already believe from our parents and our family. But then when we get to the age of about 18 to 25, sort of early adulthood, we seem to go through a period of uncertainty and change and openness to change, and it seems to be at this point that we are most readily persuadable to change our views and change our beliefs. And then after this point, it's not as if we completely stop being persuadable, but rather it goes down and down then as our age goes up. We become less and less easy to persuade. I guess we get more fixed in our ways and more resistant to attitude change. But of course, resistance to attitude change is something that can occur at any age, and there are even specific methods that you can use to deliberately make yourself or make other people more resistant to being persuaded if you wanted to do that, and we'll look at some of those next. There are a number of methods that you can use if you want to resist persuasion, want to be harder to persuade, or if you want to make others harder to persuade. One of the ones that I've talked about already several times is selective exposure. The most effective method to avoid being persuaded is not to hear the message, or not to be exposed to it in any way. As educators, we often run into this problem in that sometimes when we're trying to sort of convince students to take their studies more seriously, to attend more regularly, to maybe put more effort into their study or their academic preparation, we end up, as they say, preaching to the choir. We end up only reaching the people who are already doing this, who are already turning up regularly and already making lots of effort. And it's often very difficult to reach the people we really want to reach because they're not there. And this is one of the great truisms of persuasion, that it's very difficult to persuade people who aren't there to be persuaded. You can try different methods, different sort of methods of reaching them, but fundamentally, if they're not going to listen, it's very hard to persuade somebody. Now, even managing to kind of get through to them and get them to the point where they actually listen to your message, there's still no guarantee they're going to listen to you. Some people resist persuasion for a number of reasons. I mean, we looked at dissonance earlier, that people sometimes don't want to have to change one belief, because if they change that one, it's going to mean changing others, and they don't want to have to do that, or they know if you persuade them to change their belief about which study they should be doing, they're going to need to change their behaviour, and people are often very reluctant to do that because they're comfortable in their behaviour and they don't want to have to change. Now, there's a number of ways in which they can avoid being persuaded. I mean, we looked at this a little bit already with Dissonance, that they can sort of rationalise your message. So they can trivialise the issue and say, oh well, this issue isn't important, in which case the dissonance between what they now know from what you've told them and what they're doing isn't important. It's not critical that their behaviour and what they know aren't exactly in alignment. Or they may try what they call to source derogation, where they try to make the source of the message unconvincing. It's the shoot the messenger approach to avoiding persuasion. So you say to yourself, I don't have to listen to him, he's unrealistic, nobody could do the sort of things he wants me to do as a student. Or, oh no, don't listen to him, he's just, he doesn't want anybody to have any fun, he's no fusspot who wants everybody to be staying in all night and reading like he does. And so we use this way of discrediting the source, and so thus making this sort of message less persuasive. We don't have to listen to them because they're not a reasonable person. However, there's ways in which you can prepare other people in such a way as to make them resistant to persuasion, and they call this the inoculation effect. This is where, if you know that there's going to be an attempt to persuade them to do something and you want them to resist that attempt, what you do is you expose them to a little bit of the message they're going to hear from the other source. And you tell them a bit of what that source is going to tell them. But then after telling them a little bit of it, you then discredit the message, you take it apart, you highlight its flaws, or you invent flaws if it doesn't have some already. And thus when they hear the message for real, they'll already be prepared with counter-arguments in their head. Now this was first developed as a method when the Americans were fighting in the Korean War. And there was a concern that their soldiers were being, if you like, brainwashed, as they saw it, or persuaded by the propaganda of the other side. And they realised there was no way to prevent the soldiers encountering the other side's propaganda, and so instead they hit on this method of instead introducing them deliberately to some of that propaganda in controlled amounts, and then at the same time discrediting the propaganda the minute they presented it. And this was called inoculation because it had a certain similarity to what doctors do, that they give you a small exposure to an illness so that you can build up the antibodies to that illness. Now, it's less common for educators to try and inoculate their students to prevent them from being persuaded by something. But it can happen, certainly in cases where people worry about sort of the effects of advertising undoing the good of maybe a scheme to promote healthy behaviour. You might seek to inoculate your students against the kind of temptations and persuasions they're going to see from advertisers, which might cause them to give up their good behaviour. So it might still be useful as an educator. I'd like to now take this final part of the session to look at a particular issue, an example, if you like, where there was a particular issue in which we might wish to persuade people, and ask you to consider how you could use some of the things you've already learned in this session to be more effective at persuading them. From talking about one kind of inoculation to a very different kind. The issue I want us to use as our sort of thought experiment on how to apply some of the things we've just learned about persuasion is one which you may or may not be familiar with. It may depend on how interested you are in this kind of thing, scandals and medical scandals, or if you have young children of a certain age, this may or may not have popped up on your radar. But it occurred a number of years ago now, and it is to do with a case study, which was carried out by this individual, Mr. Wakefield, and along with a number of other researchers and participants, talked to a number of cases, about 13 cases, of children who had, as they saw it, developed autistic spectrum disorders in or around the point at which they had received the MMR, the measles, mumps and rubella jab. And the fear over immunisation is not new. In fact, for more than 20 or 30 years now, there have been certain people who have tried to lay responsibility for development of autistic spectrum disorders on immunisation. Fundamentally, they just have a problem with immunisation and are looking for a reason to rubbish it. And originally they suggested that there was a preservative used in immunisation inoculations called thimerosal, which they say broke down into a form of mercury, and that was to blame. However, and that turned out to be a myth, because it didn't produce anything like the effect that they said it would, or anything like the amount of mercury they said it would. They simply took another approach and suggested that the immune response produced by the immunisation jab itself was causing the development of autism. Now, more sober and impartial assessments have noted that while there has been an increase in rates of autism in or around about the same time that immunisation has come in, it's almost entirely down to changes in the way that autism is diagnosed, new criteria which are broader and thus produce a higher level of incidence of autism, simply because they now recognise more things as autism. And what's really interesting is that if you use the old autism criterion on the current population, you get about the same level as autism that they used to get back in the day. So it's not that autism has spiked or increased, as some people like to say, but simply that we are now recognising more things as being on the autistic spectrum. But this case study by Wakefield, reawakened the old fears and the old argument, as it appeared to find a link between a medical reaction to the inoculation, which the author of the report, Wakefield, described as autistic enterocolitis, and suggested that the vaccine caused the gastrointestinal reaction, the autistic enterocolitis, and that in turn produced autistic disorder development in the individual. And this caused considerable stir, real panic among mums and dads who were worried about whether or not they should bring their children in for immunisation. Well, what happened next? The furore kicked off by the Wakefield case study caused a number of different reactions. One from the medical community was that it kicked off a number of very large-scale studies trying to see if there was any empirical evidence to support the case study's claims. Because you have to remember, a case study doesn't actually prove anything is happening. It's such a small number of people, there's no way of excluding the possibility there might be other factors which explain the outcome and not the ones the case study says. So a case study is really just making a sort of a claim but not providing the evidence. So they carried out a number of large-scale studies, and those took a number of years, but they concluded, all of them, that there was nothing behind the claim, that there was no link between the receiving of the MMR jab and level of autism development in people who received it or people who didn't receive it afterwards. And so this scientifically showed that there was no link. But the thing became a lot more sort of high profile. If that had been all there was, the thing became a lot more high profile when it began to emerge through the investigations of an investigative reporter, Brian Deere, that actually there were some pretty serious flaws and even potential cases of fraud in Wakefield's own case study. He found that Wakefield himself had a number of undeclared conflicts of interest, that he was essentially working with a company to develop an alternative method of inoculation, so he had, let's say, a vested interest in rubbishing the current one. He had manipulated his data to produce the result that he wanted to find, and that essentially a lot of the people who sort of originally were participants in his report when it emerged what he had done with the data and his own conflicts of interest then withdrew their support and no longer wished to be associated with the report. So it fairly conclusively came out that Wakefield was not to be trusted and that his report was not credible. But the damage was done. There were a number of people who, having heard the horror stories that circulated in the media when the original case study report originally came out, didn't really keep up with the developments, or if they did, the developments weren't enough to undo the damage, undo the fear created by the original study. And so levels of inoculation went well down in a number of areas, and correspondingly levels of the disease which the inoculation was supposed to inoculate you against went up. And there was a serious problem, and still is. There's a knock-on effect in a number of areas of the UK and in a number of other countries. And this is where we come in as our hypothetical example of how trying to persuade people. How are we going to persuade people that the MMR jab is now completely safe? And this is your education thought exercise for this session. Despite the fact that the scientific evidence which has emerged since the original claims of the case study has overwhelmingly sort of disputed the claim that there's any link between MMR jab and autism, there are still in certain sectors of society people who are unwilling to allow their children to be immunised because of fears that they might lead to autism. I've included on the slide there a real quote from a forum posting. Interestingly, the forum posting was below a newspaper article which was discussing how there had been a considerable amount of fraud in Wakefield's study. So even though the article itself was saying, don't trust the case study, it was fraudulent, in the discussion forum below it, there were still a number of people who were saying, oh, I don't know, I'm still not going to get my kids immunised, as the case is with the example you're seeing there on the screen. So it seems that if we want to reach these people, we need to do something more than we're already doing. And I want you to treat this as a thought exercise. Imagine that you are taken on by the Department of Health and they want you to come up with a new way to reach these people. Now this is an education issue because you're trying to persuade them to change their behaviour, to take up the option to get their children immunised when they might not otherwise do that, and that's a form of education. So thinking about everything we've talked about so far, about how an attitude is, the dual process theories, the Yale Model, all things we know about sources and messages and audiences. Let's pause this recording and take about 5 or 10 minutes to sketch a few ideas about how we could reach these people. And remember, the point of this exercise is not just to dream up an idea, but to do it linking to some of the things we've talked about, or I've talked to you about in this presentation so far. So if you're going to make a suggestion, it needs to in some way draw on something you've just learned about persuasion or about attitudes, because the idea is just to practice using psychology and finding ways to apply it to practical real life situations. So, like I said, pause the recording, have a think about how to do it. What would you do? How would you link your ideas back to some of the things we've learned about messages and sources and persuasion, and hopefully see if you can come up with a way of applying psychology to this issue to improve the effectiveness of the persuasive message to get these people using the MMR jab again. Okay, hopefully you've paused the recording and you're now ready to, I'll walk you through a few examples of what you might have done to see, to use some of the things we've talked about so far to make your pro-MMR jab message more persuasive. It's likely that one of the problems the previous attempts have had in trying to persuade people is that the source of the message has not been as credible or as attractive as it needs to be to make the message truly persuasive. So it's not what we're saying, but who is saying it. And so ideally we need to find a single individual who combines all the elements of trustworthiness and expertise with likability or attractiveness. One way to do this would be to consider who are we aiming it at, because if we want to make them similar, want to make them likable, it would be best if we can make them similar to the target audience. Now, I didn't tell you any particular group that there was a low uptake on NMR jabs or NMR inoculation, but if we were to say find out that mums between sort of 18 and 20 or 18 and 22 were particularly low on MMR jab uptake, then a source that was high profile, celebrity, but in the same age group, and critically also a parent who's got children who are going to get the jab, that would be an ideal source, because they would be, we need them to be an authority of some sort. So they can either be an expert or maybe just somebody highly respected. Definitely attractive, definitely trustworthy. Now, if their own children have received the MMR jab, that's going to speak a lot to their trustworthiness, because if they're willing to sort of put their money where their mouth is, it'll make them more trustworthy. So maybe it's a case of talking to people who haven't taken up the jab or of that age group and finding out who they admire. The old standby of finding a good spokesperson for that group. But remember, that individual needs to combine elements of expertise and credibility, but also likability and attractiveness. Once we've found our source, then we need to consider the style of message that's going to work. Are we going to go for information, or are we going to go for emotion? It's an emotional issue, and it's likely that there's going to be, since there's already a considerable amount of information out there about this, another informational approach probably won't work. That the direct routes, it doesn't seem to be reaching everybody, and so we need to combine it with an indirect approach, peripheral or a heuristic approach, using emotion. So possibly a fear-based approach, a bit like some of the ones we saw on the Dettol ads, would probably be good enough. Have to be careful we don't overdo the fear, so we don't get a boomerang effect, but we also have to consider how close we make the message to their own views. We don't want to simply completely present a message that's the opposite of their own views, and yet we don't want to appear to be agreeing with them. So we're going to need to look for that sort of latitude and non-commitment, where we acknowledge their fears, but then show that there's nothing too much to be afraid about. So we recognise their fears, so that they feel, yeah, these people are speaking to me, these people don't completely disagree with me, but at the same time, we don't appear to agree with them. We also, in terms of the audience, we might want to consider the issue of selective exposure. How are we going to reach them? Where are we going to send our message that will be guaranteed to get through to them? Well, again, it's important that we know who our target audience is and what sort of things they are likely to access, you know? So do we put it in magazines? Do we put it in adverts around certain TV shows? Do we put it on certain websites? We might try to get around the selective exposure stuff by making it a mandatory part of something that is going to happen anyway, such as mandatory health checks. We also need to be mindful of potential inoculation, that it may be that the anti-MMR lobby, who just don't like medical inoculation, that they might have sort of tried to prepare them against this sort of thing. We also need to be sort of prepare them against hearing more fear-based messages from the anti-vaccination group. So we have to do our own little bit of attitude inoculation, tell them the anti-vaccination stuff they're going to hear, and then take it apart so that we protect them against having their attitudes changed again by someone else who wants to convince them that vaccination is a bad idea. Right, hopefully in my suggestions there I'll have touched on some of the same ideas that you've had. Maybe you had completely different ideas to mine, but the important thing is that if you were able to link the ideas you had to some elements of psychology that we've talked about, then you're hitting the target as far as this exercise is concerned. It's purely about finding ways, practicing ways to apply psychology to real life issues. Where does that leave us? In the end, what I was hoping to show you this second part of this session is that although the act of persuasion is a complex thing, which can involve many different elements, that it's possible to break these down into an understandable system which allow you to look at any one part and understand what's going on there. And so even though successful persuasion is going to involve elements of the source and the message and the audience, it's still possible for you to, as an educator, seek to improve one of those at a time. You don't have to do all of them all the time, but instead, the more you understand about them, the more you can sort of fine-tune each one of them to ensure that you're maximising your effectiveness as a persuader. I also hope that I've shown you that understanding persuasion is something that will be of real tangible use to you as an educator. That education, certain types of education definitely, is very much an act of persuasion. And the better we understand the process, the better we'll be at doing it, and the better we'll be at succeeding in achieving our goals, to educate people and persuade them to take up activities and opportunities that we know will benefit them in the long run. Thank you very much for patiently listening. I hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you.